Now, I should tell you, before I get into the psalm, and this is our side road off of our study from the book of Hebrews in the 5th chapter, but we're studying Psalm 2 right now. And I want to say a few things that I think are probably quite timely as we get into certain things regarding this psalm, but also for future reference and future messages. No prophecy of Scripture is of private interpretation. And when it comes to prophecy and things prophetic, the reason, it's in God's book, that's reason enough we should want to learn, but it should increase our faith. No one should ever approach prophecy with a perverse curiosity of things that seem like a mystery and hard to understand, because they will remain just that for you. They will never inspire more faith, and that is what understanding prophecy should be. It should be a clear sign that God is in control. Certain things that God said aforetime, and we've got a variety of prophecies to us, those that have been fulfilled, those that are presently being fulfilled, and those that are yet to be fulfilled. And if you are like those people who approach all things desiring to know, and it is indeed looking back at the things that have been declared, that have happened, God said something back there, and in prophecies that have already come to pass, it should inspire and increase our faith that the prophecies that are yet to unfold and yet to occur, if God were so faithful as to keep his word to those things he promised aforetime, which he made come to pass, how much more to the things yet to come? God is in control. So the whole purpose, I'm prefacing this because we'll touch on a little prophecy here. I don't know if we'll get to it exactly today, although in some part we will perhaps. What I wish to say is that if your perspective towards prophecy is not right, your understanding will not be right. Furthermore, in the big scheme of things, what I'm touching on, if I had the time to do it, which I don't want to do right now, but I've kind of thought that it would be a good thing to reintroduce to those people who are newer and refresh for those who have been here a long time, which is that no prophecy in Revelation can be understood apart from you must study the book of Daniel and the book of Ezekiel. Those are absolute requirements. There are even Psalms that will benefit us. And then the minor prophets, which must be studied. So all of these things that work together. And apart from that concept, understanding that the lost tribes are not lost. I know I'm watching this happen now with my teaching on Psalm 2, that there are many people out there who I feel like I'm a shadow of what used to happen to Dr. Scott. I'm seeing the same thing happen because apparently someone has started a series on Hebrews and magically they stopped right where I have. I don't know. But what I am saying is that the very essence of what's done should... Sometimes there are some of these messages that have been very heavy and very laborious to make a point that you might leave here thinking, I didn't crystallize the whole thing, I didn't gestalt it, it hasn't yet sunk in. But as we go, the case builds. So sometimes learning, especially the way we're doing it, will require that we have some background and some knowledge. So I'm going to try and reference as much as I can when it pertains, and perhaps at a future time, and hopefully in the near future, between going back to Hebrews and some points in between, we can maybe start looking at prophecy again, because there's a lot of things taking place right now that are quite interesting for those that are curious about how the current events tie into what we're told in the end time, regarding the end time in the Bible. So, having said that, I'm taking us back into Psalm 2, as I said, and see if I can pick green as my color. But the psalmist asks for what or for why. We talked about these, which are gatherings of the heathen and of the peoples who are essentially meditating in vain. It's empty. And the kings of the earth, which we discussed, which we saw in a mirror picture being referred to clearly in the book of Acts in the 4th chapter. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord. Now I'm reading from the King James again, against his anointed. And this is quite important because these people, as I pointed out last week, the italicized saying, although it's not there, we know italics are always used and added by the translators, and most of the time they shouldn't be there, but this actually facilitates our understanding. It's these people, these kings of the earth and rulers, that are saying, let us break their bands asunder. We don't want the word or the authority of the word or the authority that comes with the word. We explained that. I have explained that already. And, of course, last week we touched on verses 4 and 5. And I prefaced the message there by saying that when God laughs, it ain't going to be funny, which it still stays in my head. But, I penciled in my Bible something between, it was a tiny space between the 3rd and the 4th verse, and I kind of put silence in the heavens. In a strange way, it made me think of Revelation, in the book of Revelation, where there's silence for a little time, a little space of time, and then all wrath is poured out and some really terrible things are happening. But it made me think of this, as God will not be silent forever on the things pertaining to what people have conspired against him and his anointed. So he that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. And we kind of picked this apart a little bit last week. He will laugh that imperfect which is not finished, and the Lord, he will mock at them. Now, some people might say, well, and I've heard this before, I don't like that God would do such a thing. Well, this is how you can understand the love of God. Much like, forgive me because I don't mean to make a comparison, but much like giving you correction, which is absolutely unpleasant for me, and mine is very mild. God's correction will not be mild at all. But you can understand that God does this because he does love his people that are his chosen people. And don't go down the line thinking I just said something that pertains to the Jew, because that's another subject when you get into Revelation and prophecy that you can understand that you must look back at the promises made to Abraham and the fulfillment of some of those which most people are sorely mistaken. They aim towards it must be the Jews, and it is not. That's a story for another day, and that was not an anti-Semitic slur, but a reality of right scriptural interpretation, which at some point we will uncover together. Now, we have God reacting to what these people have done. Then, King James, then shall he speak unto them in his wrath and vex them in his sore displeasure. And that's kind of where we left off. Now, let me take a new page, as I want to investigate something with you. And I'm actually liking writing here versus going over there. See, over there, when I make a mistake, I can't erase it. Over here, it just magically can disappear, which is wonderful. It's a beautiful thing. So my tablet is like the New Testament, and that's like the Old Testament. Never mind. All right. First book of Scott, Illustrations for Struggling Preachers. All right. Never mind. Somebody out there will take that and run with it, I'm sure. All right. So here we have, and you'll see why probing this will matter. We have here the beginning of verse 6 in the Hebrew, and we have a conjunction, and I. And this and I over here, this word over here, ani, is emphatic. It's an emphatic and I. Don't think that God is just randomly talking now. We are listening to, or we're examining, the Father is speaking in this particular verse. And I'll show you as we put this together, the Father speaking and then the Son is speaking. But the Son is not just speaking, he's actually quoting the Father. It's a very interesting way this is put together. But right now I want to look at this emphatic "and I," and this word right here, which in my King James translation says, "Yet have I set," and my margin, it tells me to look at my margin, and my margin says "anointed." I don't know if any of you have that in your margin. But the interesting thing about this word is as I began to study it, I initially translated this, and on some of your papers, if you have this, I have put installed. And I'm content to put installed or set, but I wish to explain this word, which the root of this word looks like this if you were trying to look this word up in what we call the Brown Driver Brig. And the reason why I reject this being translated as anoint, first of all, and this is going to make a very important point in a theological way. So if you're looking for something that makes you float to the ceiling just yet, it's not this. This is a theological point, which is that this Hebrew word, the scholars argue that if it was pointed differently, which I'll get to in a minute, would change the meaning. But what we have here is, this is the root. In Hebrew you have roots, and then the verbs are expanded by suffixes and so forth. We have a verb that is in the call, and all that means is simple and active. That's all it means. Call translates to that. It's just a simple act. And it's in the perfect. That tells us that it is an act. This, we'll call it for right now, installation or setting, is something that occurred back there. And there's nothing wrong with understanding that this is the reason why I teach grammar and the reason why I've invited you who are learning Hebrew to keep probing, because when we dig, we find out that although this is in a simple active voice in the perfect, which should mean it's historically done, it means somewhere back there in the eons of time, God declared a thing which the effects of which may keep continuing in the now, and the full effects of it have not yet been seen. That there you have, I just opened the door to prophecy for you, because prophecy, as my late husband used to say, is like mountain ranges. And although looking at them, you may think that they're stuck together, but if you go to walk closely, you'll see there are many great valleys and chasms between those mountains that from a distance look like they were all clustered together. And this is the idea of prophecy. So in a quick reading, in the English, we have, "Yet have I set my king." But in beginning to pick this word apart, something spoke to me very clearly. As I said, the margin says anointed. And the trouble with that is that we've already seen this, the word for anointed, the root for anointed in Hebrew, and you'll be familiar with this, looks like that. We have that from which we get Mashuach, Messiah. That's the word for anoint. We've already encountered that in our psalm, in the second verse, and his anointed. That's a cognative and a derivative of this word. So I began probing, and I came to you, I think I was sitting on festival last week, and we began to look at this word. And I did further research. Now, the root of this word has several meanings. At first, I was just going to dispense with the several meanings, but upon taking a closer look, I realized that these several meanings are quite important for our total understanding. So, for the root of this word, nasak, and let me cut that. That looks like I put a big giant vowel underneath it, and that's just not there. All right. Many emendations have been proposed for nasak. There's a footnote from the Theological Dictionary that says the debate focuses on its meaning and the expression nasakti, Malki, which is my installed king. Many scholars follow the Septuagint in reading a nifal. Remember, I just said to you that this is in the call, how we are reading this. They are following a nifal verb, which simply means that this is changed. There'll be a few changes of the vowels. The essential word stays the same, but this is what happens in Hebrew. If you mess these vowels up, it may become a different word. That's the simplest way I can say this. The same word will fall into another category of conjugation, which puts it into another meaning. So, for example, one word starting off in a simple action. Let's say the one word was me. It was me. And that's a simple action. And then in the next category, me will have some attachment to it, and me will become passive, the passive of me. And it'll build then and have some suffix endings. And that same word for me will become intensive, like me, right? And then you step again, and then there'll be that intensive me, but in a passive way, like, all right. So that's what happens with the Hebrew. It's just these one word that then basically, by adding on different endings and vowels, transforms itself along the way. I just simplified Hebrew grammar for those of you who are not interested in learning grammar. At least you get a fundamental picture of what I'm talking about. So these scholars are saying that if it was pointed another way, it would become the passive voice, and it would have this meaning of a libation, pouring out. They interpret it as to be consecrated with a drink offering. And a scholar by the name of Harmut Gies doubts this citing because of Proverbs 8:23, where Proverbs 8:23 says that wisdom was established essentially from the ages. That word, the same word appearing there. So that this is why the scholars are perplexed. This is what we're doing right now has probably made a lot of people lose their hair over hundreds of, maybe thousands of years of trying to figure out how can this come together. But this is what I started looking at. If you go back into the theological dictionary to look up this word, which I've now just crippled, you find its first word, its first use, Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament. Throughout the ancient world, libation played an important role in a wide range of sacrificial practices. Now I'm reading this, and now I'm suddenly like, ding, because we know what the next verse is going to deal with. The next verse, verse 7 in our psalm, is dealing with the resurrected Christ, a declaration of his resurrection. And the importance of us understanding verses 6 and verses 7 will be crucial to understand why the writer of Hebrews used it. He wasn't just quoting Scripture, just to quote Scripture. There's a real set purpose in there. So, we have here a wide range of sacrificial practices under this word. There was a great variety both in nature and act, complete or partial emptying of the vessel, all right? And whatever materials that might be offered as an offering, sometimes as tribute, as propitiation. I'm reading these words, and I'm suddenly getting more excited about the definition of this because I'm seeing more and more that this describes many things about Christ, while he was first here, and his crucifixion and being poured out, and then reminds me of what it will be like at his second coming. So there's two dynamics for me to pay attention to now. It's noteworthy that libation almost never appears as an independent sacrificial act. It is usually a preliminary offering with a specific symbolic function. So my mind's still going on this. I went to the lexicon, Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon, and they define this same word, nasak, as a libation, a drink offering, then secondarily as to cast a statue or an image, to melt, to spread. The Ugaritic says to pour out. The Syriac and the Arabic say to pour out, to make an offering. The Akkadian nasaku, to throw down flat. And in the lexicon I was reading from, they are vacillating between how this, it's interesting, how this word should be translated. Now, this will show you it's complex. It's not a simple thing to deal with. But I want you to capture why I said I was going to leave it as installed and set, but I want you to see what may be underneath it all that will really kind of paint a little bit of color for us. Now, if we went along the hypothesis, as some have hypothesized, that this word being translated in the Septuagint, that is the Greek, the Septuagint, the Greek text of the 2nd, 3rd century before Christ, and we left it the way they are translating it, or the way they have translated it, what we would have is essentially not an act that could be construed as occurring on earth, but rather solely reserved in heaven. But if you understand this verb that we're looking at and its function in the call, which is a simple act, but it's perfect, and you finish the rest of the sentence, which is, I'm going to still use this English word for a minute, I have set or installed my king, Melechi, my king, and I'm going to have to go downwards a little bit here, El Zion, that is on Zion, my Har, that is hill, and Kodeshi, my hill of holiness, or my holy hill. Now, if you were reading it as the Septuagint reads, and as some have preferred to try and read, it could be construed that this appointment is only heavenly and it is not terrestrial. But if you understand this word in Hebrew, the nasak word, to carry the connotation set or install, but by pouring out onto my holy hill, you grab a theological concept that says that this is in reference to something terrestrial and not limited to celestial. God in heaven, the Father is speaking, and he says, and I have. Now, I'm still going to use the word installed or set, but I want you to think of underneath that, I have poured out my king upon Zion, my holy hill. And then you get something that cannot be fudged theologically from, because there are many people that would like to talk about Zion, and because they do not understand what Zion means, confusion comes. So, let me address a few things, but I do want to make clear that this one verb, a simple act declared in the past, will have a two-pronged activity. There is the declaration being made by God emphatically, I have set, I have poured out, and the understanding, which is kind of interesting. We were just reading about the kings of the earth, how they have set themselves. Well, it's almost as if God is saying, yeah, you can do that. And you can be kings of the earth for a time, but I have set my king, and I'm going to put this big my king. God the Father, speaking of the Son, I have poured out, I have poured down, I have installed, I have set, by that method, my king. You can have your king for a time, and you can do whatever you want with him, but my king, you'll read on in the following verses that why he's saying my king, that is God the Father, speaking of the Son, will rule this earth. So, let's talk about Zion for a minute. Where do I begin? All right. So, I'm going to show you, and I want you to follow this with me so that at some point there's absolutely no confusion about what we're talking about. The first time we encounter Zion proper is in 2 Samuel 5. If you want to turn there, I'd like for you to make these notes. At some point, you can do your own detective work. The first time we encounter it proper. Now, there'll be people say, well, what about the references of it occurring under different names earlier in the Bible? I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in making a point right now. So in 2 Samuel, 5th chapter, beginning at the 6th verse, the king and his men went to Jerusalem unto the Jebusites, and the inhabitants of the land, which spake unto David, saying, Except thou take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come hither, thinking David cannot come in hither. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, the same as the city of David. So let's make that a clear picture in our mind. I almost hate to try and draw a map for you You're going to hate this. I am too. So without any distinction of any gates right now, please don't think this is a good representation of let's just pretend for a minute that this is Mount Moriah. And let's do this so we can kind of, unfortunately, make things look like they should be or like they are. Forgive that crooked, whatever it's supposed to be. All right, Mount Moriah. And looking on a map, as they have now clearly excavated, so you may have preconceived ideas of where the city of David is, but current excavation shows the city of David to be down under here. I know that sounds counterintuitive. Many people have placed it to be here. Many people have placed it over here, but neither one of those is right. And I even shared with you when I said they have found David's palace. David had multiple palaces. This is one of them that they are beginning to unearth. And it's a fascinating look because not that I'm one that says, oh, give me the tangible so I can believe, because my faith is already settled in the Bible. I don't need structures and things and tzatskis to prove a point. However, what is important here, it says David dwelt in the fort, and we'll put the fort, and I said my map drawing is not good here, so don't go, oh, that doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like it. Right now it could be Utah for all you know. No, I take that back. All right, so we have the fort perhaps maybe here. And if I were to move this up, let me make this slightly smaller and move it up. See, this is why I like this, because I can erase this, which I can't do there. But the reason why I'm showing you this, if this is the fort, and we'll call this potentially the city of David, and there's this kind of area here, which we're going to call the water that represents Gihon, and then there's a stepped area here, and then there's a sharp embankment, which is called Milo, which is referred to here. David dwelt in the fort, called it the city of David, and David built round about from Milo and inward. So from approximately this area and inward, David built. And there's, as I said, they are excavating presently. I think they just stopped it. The excavation of this project just stopped about 6 months ago or 7 months ago due to some political things going on, which is another story. But this is the first mention of Zion, clearly, where no one will say, well, it's ambiguous. It's very clear. Now, what's important about this mention is that it was a Jebusite fortress. And to understand the history of that, which becomes important for our understanding, you've got to go back and travel back. You're going, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. We have to go back to go forward. So without making you spin backwards, let me just kind of give you the synopsis. In order to understand how the Jebusites got there, in Genesis 10, we read about the sons of Noah, and we read how Ham's son Canaan, who was cursed, and it is his descendants, the descendants of Canaan, the cursed line, or the cursed one, and his descendants, the Jebusites. It says that Canaan had children, Sidon, Heth, and then begins this line of the Jebusites, the Hivites, all the ites. So any type of ite that you can imagine, they're in that group. And then it defines clearly what part of the land they had spread into. If you were reading at your own leisure, Genesis 10, you can read geographically where they had spread out into that land. From the north, Sidon, to the south, Gaza, to slightly inward, Gerar, to slightly more inward, where you have, hypothetically, the location of Sodom and Gomorrah. So you've got this triangulated area that belongs to, does not belong to, but it is controlled by, if you will, Canaanite, and the descendants of that line. And so we know they were dwelling in the land, and you've got to keep reading and go into the history of the promises given to Abraham. And you say, wow, this is like a wild goose chase, but it makes perfect sense when you see it all lined up together. In Genesis 15, God gives Abraham a promise. You remember, he tells them that I'm going to take the people. He essentially tells them about the people going in for 400 years, and they'll come out, and they will come out richer than when they went in. And if you begin reading in verse 18, the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt under the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaims, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Now, I'm going to jump 400 plus years to the future. God said, this is why prophecy is amazing. God said that people are going to go in 400 years and they'll come out. Well, now I'm jumping to 400 plus years later when they've come out. Go to Deuteronomy 7, just to show you the progression of what happens to this place we're looking for. Deuteronomy 7. When the Lord, now the people have already come out, they've been wandering around, and I don't need to give you the history of this. When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittite, the Girgashite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. When you get in there and you do that, and they're told, in no uncertain terms, you go in there and you kick them out. You destroy them, okay? That's what's told right there. There's some beautiful things told as well in this 7th chapter. But we know for a fact, if you keep reading and following Judges, Joshua and Joshua first rather, that they went into that land and they were unable to kick out and annihilate the Jebusites. And they remained, and they dwelled, it says, with the children of Benjamin. They remained there. So the Jebusites remained with the children of Benjamin, dwelling in Jerusalem. Because you might say, well, how did a fort like this get established? And we know that they were never eradicated. It seems that they dwelt there in peace. And now I fast forward you back to 2 Samuel, because there we encounter for the first time this fortress, which gives you a little background that these people were inhabiting that land, which a lot of people think, well, how could those people have inhabited? But they were. And if you want to get even more confused, those people will disappear. The mention of the Jebusites will disappear in Zechariah 9. They will be last mentioned as analogous to Ekron, and then they will disappear. And then a couple of 100 years later, they will reappear as the Yasubi people in Nigeria. Now, you can do that. You want to go and have fun, you can dig, and that's a great mystery that these people that live there today profess to trail their line all the way back to Yebus. So it's very interesting. But anyway, we could go off on that and have a lot of fun, but I don't want to do that. So here we are. David takes the fort, and he builds. And then if you read down, it also says that Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messages to David, 2 Samuel 5 and 11, because David now is going to build a house. And he builds that house right next to or in close proximity to the fort. And this is what they are currently excavating in my fabulous drawing right here. That's what they're currently excavating. Now, what's interesting is that David now desires to bring the Ark of the Covenant, and that turns into be a big debacle and quite disastrous. He wants to bring it, and we know in the transportation, the terrible thing that happened. And then, of course, the ark stayed at the house of Obed-Edom for a time. And then finally, David says, I want to build a house for the Ark of the Covenant, a house for God. And, of course, he was not permitted to, but Solomon does at a later time. So you've got to almost jump to one point to another. Initially, this area down here, my drawing will pay off eventually. Initially, down here, this is considered Zion, the initial location of Zion. Now, modern geographical whatnot has Mount Zion to be right here, the physical Mount Zion, as they call it, which is in the Armenian quarter. That's, if you're looking at a modern map, that's the way they would put it here with geographical topographical grade and elevation. And that is greatly debated, as well as so many other things, depending on whose map you're looking at. If you're looking at a Catholic map, and if you're looking at a Jewish map, everybody has a different idea. It's the only place in the world where ambiguity matches the language. The cartography is slightly faulted. But anyway, it doesn't matter. We know this, that at the very close of David's life, one of the last things he does is he numbers the people, and that displeases God, and that brings a plague on God's people. And we know that David desired to, he repented, he wanted to make an offering, so he goes and he buys the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And that threshing floor is purportedly this location right here, which is Mount Moriah. It's kind of interesting that this threshing floor, or that general area, which we know that Abraham was ready to sacrifice Isaac on, and in Genesis 22, it says, "In the mount of the Lord it shall be seen," or provided or seen. It's interesting that this will still remain the center point at this time in David's life and then in Solomon's life. But here's the interesting thing. We transition from City of David to when the ark is finally brought up after the house, the palace, the temple is built, Solomon's temple. The ark is brought up, and we read, according to what happened in the record, that after they were finished building, they brought up the ark, which was still sitting in the city of David all this time. They brought it up, and this thing must have pleased the Lord, because it says the whole house of the Lord was filled with God's glory. So then the geographical area expands. Zion, don't think I forgot where I started, because Zion starts here and then expands to make this area, and by the way, Moriah is kind of this elevation over here, technically, if you were looking at elevation maps. And please don't go, wow, that's the worst map I've ever seen. I already know it, okay? Most of you can't even draw the map of America, so leave me alone, all right? So, but this area transfers from where the ark was and the city now to this whole area here. And the logic behind it is, as the glory of the Lord, this thing pleased the Lord and it filled the house of God, this area is now expanded. And as you keep reading, a few things are of interest. It seems like as we go through Solomon's reign, Solomon does something else, I should say parenthetically, with the Jebusites. He does enslave them to do his work for him. It's kind of one of those sidebars that je ne sais pas. But this remains like this. This territory remains like this and is labeled as such. And when you read, you'll read that it just somehow expands. Zion does expand to this area. And then when the kingdoms divide at the death of Solomon, and we begin to have these multiple factions and different ruling kings for a time, and then when the people are carried away, I'm jumping over lots of Bible history, and the people are carried away into captivity, then at that time, the people then are referred to as the people of Zion. They're no longer referred to, in many cases, especially in the Psalms and in the prophetic realm, they are no longer being referred to specifically as the children of Israel, but some are being referred to as, you'll read this in Scripture, daughters of Zion, children of Zion. And these now, we went from a geographical specific slice to actually extend, if you will, to this whole area that then becomes the inhabitants of this area, that then becomes known as the people. And there's much confusion because people would like to keep Zion in a celestial realm and say, well, this only exists as a celestial place. And I'd have to say two things. There are two dynamics at work. Much like if you remember how I'm trying to describe, if I ever get there, how God said to Moses, see to it that you build the tabernacle exactly like this. Why? Because it represented what was foreseen in heaven, yet to come down to earth, that Christ would be the fulfillment of all these things. Well, Zion has a twofold meaning. As you move through the Scriptures, being referred to as the people, as the populace, And all you have to do is read some of the different scriptures that make it quite clear we're no longer talking about a strict location, but we are talking about now a people. The people will also be associated with the temple. The people in the temple will become synonymous. The Temple Mount, the people, it'll be... So if you were reading, for example, places like Jeremiah 50 and 51, the voice of them that flee and escape out of the land of Babylon to declare in Zion the vengeance of the Lord our God, the vengeance of his temple. They become synonymous. Equally so, in Psalm 133, Zion will become plural, the mountains of Zion, which tells you now it is understood as not only the people, but a geographical place. And we are certain, when we study this, that I'm not just talking about, could this only be celestial? No, this is celestial in some places and terrestrial in others. And this must be made clear. Otherwise, when you get down the road, this is what is important. By the time 586 and the final carrying away of the people and then the return of the people, or by 70 AD, in an eschatological way, Zion and the concept of Zion has not been removed. Now, I only briefly touch on this to say, there was much to do about people taking a stand, the concept of Zionism today, which is a far-flung concept from what biblically is portrayed. And we have a very clear picture of Zion as it is regarding the end times. Now, you can say, I'm not so sure that I'd like to dabble down this direction, but I'm pretty sure that you and I, we could talk about this all day long. There are a few things that are certain. There are a few certain things that will come to pass. We are not here endlessly. We are not here in perpetuity as endless creations, but to each person a time must come, whether the time is in your lifetime that you will live out your life, or whether you believe in a concept which people grossly misunderstand called the rapture, for which I would simply say there are many raptures, not just one rapture. And I don't want you to go, wow, that's kind of crazy, because the Bible shows that there are already multiple raptures that occurred in the Old Testament. When people say, well, the rapture's not biblical, well, then neither is the Trinity, because the word Trinity doesn't appear in the Bible. So, go try and toss your monkeys at somebody else. But, the logic is, well, that's a made-up concept. Well, wait a minute. Enoch walked with God and he was not. Will anybody debate that that's a taking away? That's a taking away. And there are many people in the Old Testament that were taken away. How do you explain the prophet Elijah? Taken away. Oh, that doesn't count. Just like there were many people caught up and taken away in the New Testament, you read about Philip being caught away, and the greatest one of all is Jesus. We saw him, we're reading in the book of Acts, the end of Luke, beginning of the book of Acts, looking up and watching him go. Well, the rapture is not a real doctrine. Well, then to those people that don't believe that, and there will be multiple ones, especially when I read the diversities of things that can be concluded, it's quite clear I don't think there's going to be one event. Now that is speculation on my part, but based on what has happened through the bulk of the Bible, I don't think it's going to be a one-event deal here. And you can hypothesize all you want, and I can hypothesize all I want. All I know is there's not been a single rapture. There have been multiple catchings away in the Bible. Don't argue that because the word doesn't appear but once, therefore it cannot be doctrine. As I said, the word Trinity doesn't appear, but no one would argue except if you don't read the Bible about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. All right, so what I'm trying to say, I don't even know how I got here now, but see, the problem is when you start me going, it's just, forget about it. The thing I want to share about Zion in a future time, though, is this. We'll start first in the book of Joel, so you can kind of get a flavor. We'd have to spend a lot of time, and I don't want to invest that much time in this because this will merit its own study. Joel, who's part of the minor prophets, and if you can find him, he's hiding out in my Bible today between stuck pages. And the beauty of this is that you can definitely, I'd like to also read out of Micah as well. It's just too many. And Obadiah. All right, sorry. Joel 3. You begin at verse 16. The Lord also shall roar out of Zion, utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall shake. But the Lord will be the hope of all of his people and the strength of the children of Israel. So shall ye know that I am the Lord your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain, exactly like we are reading it. Then shall Jerusalem be holy, and there shall no stranger pass through her any more. It shall come to pass in that day that the mountains shall drop down new wine, the hills shall flow with milk, all the rivers of Judah shall flow with waters. And this is the important thing. This is how you can kind of tie it to Ezekiel and Revelation, where it says, and a fountain shall come forth out of the house of the Lord, and shall water the valley of Shittim. And we know for certain that that speaks of a future time. That speaks of a future and millennium time. Egypt shall be desolate, Edom shall be a desolate wilderness for the violence against the children of Judah, because they have shed innocent blood in their land. But Judah shall dwell forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation. For I will cleanse their blood that I have not cleansed, for the Lord dwelleth in Zion. Now, there'll be people read this and say, but that doesn't sound like it could only be limited to. And of course, everybody wants to reach and say, well, that can't happen on earth. That's got to be in heaven. Well, let's see about that. Let's see if we can make sense of this. Micah 4. You can always tell the wonderful prophecies that say, but in these last days it shall come to pass that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains, the top of the top. And it shall be exalted above the hills, and the people shall flow unto it. Many nations shall come and say, come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the law shall go forth out of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And I could read on, but I've said enough. Now, these are important, pivotal, future time prophecies. And there will be a time after the tribulation, the great tribulation that occurs, that we will see a restoration. We will see the whole world will come and worship. And Jesus then will not just be King of kings for the Christians. He will be, in fact, the church should be removed by them. There are some people that say that the church is going to go through the tribulation, and if that is what you think, then you probably should go through it. From what I read, even if you are not a rapture person, from what I read, I'd place my hope that there'll be a rapture rather than to go through the tribulation, the great tribulation, because like I said, when God laughs, it ain't going to be funny. And it's not going to be the ha, ha, ha. It's going to be, wow, a bloodbath. But in Revelation 7, we read of the gathering of the 144,000. After these things, I saw 4 angels standing on. I know it's unfair if you don't have any background in Revelation. This might be perplexing, but I'll do my best to not go crazy here. After these things, I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. He cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, hurt not the earth, which gives you a picture that this is an unfolding future time event on the earth. Hurt not the earth. It doesn't say hurt not the heavens. It says hurt not the earth. Why? Because there are people that are going to be chosen out, that will be this 144,000 group, which are definitely not lost tribes, but sometimes referred to as the lost tribes. And there'll be 144 of these. I heard the number of them which were sealed. There were 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel, except for Dan, and I don't know why. Don't ask. That's future time. It's a good thing about prophecy. You can get to it later. All right. See? You got it. You're quick. The tribe of Judah was sealed 12,000. The tribe of Reuben was sealed 12,000. The tribe of Gad were sealed 12,000. Tribe of Asher, tribe of Naphtali, tribe of Manasseh, tribe of Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, tribe of Joseph, and the tribe of Benjamin. See? No Dan. And then it goes to, from this picture on earth, we go back into heaven. The seer, that is John, getting this vision, seeing all this, his vision is now transported back into the heavens. But now that I've just read who the 144,000 are, and they are not, I'm sorry, this is not, for me doctrinally, a lot of people are confused about this, but we've just itemized this. This is not what the Jehovah's Witness doctrine. A lot of people say that, anyway, it's out there. All I'm going to tell you is that these are people who are comprise the lost tribes who were never lost. And God is going to select out of these, and these are going to become preachers to the rest of the earth, which is somewhat interesting. And then if you spin forward, you'll read in Revelation 14, and here's the picture back on earth. And I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 having his Father's name written in their foreheads. And these are the ones that will go out and evangelize. These are the evangelists to the rest of the people who remain. Terrestrial place. The Lamb on Mount Zion. Terrestrial place. Lest you forget where I started, the whole thrust of this message is setting us up for something that will happen that is quite beautiful. It's covered up in English, but you can see it very plainly from the Hebrew. When the Son begins to talk in the coming verses, and he says, I will declare the decree. Think of what the Father said. The Father said, I have poured out, I have installed my King upon my holy hill, Mount Zion. Now the Son speaks, and he says, I will declare the decree. Essentially, I'm going to do the voices here. I'm going to tell you what the Father said to me. And this is what the Father said to me. He said, Thou art my Son. This day I have begotten thee. That is a future message for us, perhaps next week. And the rest of what is said, ask of me. I've never heard such blatant damage done to anything as this. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. And all of the missionaries and evangelists sending people out use this to say, see, ask of me and I shall give you, but that has nothing to do with it. And it has everything to do with what the Son is repeating to us and what he will repeat at a future time that was given to him by the Father when he returns to earth, when, at the second coming, people will be forced to acknowledge him and the wrath that will be poured out on those who do not acknowledge him as Lord of Lords, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. But here we have this great picture upcoming. I'm giving you a little something to look forward to. The ask of me is not a missionary call for you to go out, for me to go out and say, well, we'll get the nations together. That's as wacky as the people saying that the whole gospel, there's one particular group of people that think that their whole thing is to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth. And they'll be the ones that after they're done preaching, then the end. And of course, they don't read their Bible because there's going to be a second wave of preachers. I just referenced the 144,000 who will finish the job at a future time. It's our job to keep doing, and for me to stand and keep preaching and keep proclaiming. And the sole purpose for this, to wrap this up, as I began saying, prophecy should bring us to a greater faith. If God was faithful to give a prophecy to Abraham and say, and this is what's going to happen. And so 400 plus years later, and it does. And to Moses, he gives these promises, and they're passed down, and they're not promises that were limited to the Jew. And I say that because most people don't even understand these are promises given to a promised people, for which maybe we'll talk about next week when I get into this. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen. But in the meantime, this should inspire faith that we see God is not only in control historically, when he said at the very beginning, Genesis 3:15, the depiction of what needed to happen, the fruition of which is Christ coming to earth, and the ultimate vindication, his claim that he would come here to correct a wrong of humanity, die and raise up again the third day, for which he did. And those are prophecies fulfilled. Imagine how great that which is yet to come. It makes my faith even stronger that God's in control and you can trust God. Now, that's not an appeal to make you trust him. That's just simply to say, if you don't believe in the Bible at all, this won't help you. And if you're confused about prophecy, it won't help you. But if you see the crystal clear lines being drawn, it gives me the faith to know he came one time and he will be coming back again. And somewhere in between then, you say, well, what if I'm not there at that time? Some of us may catch on in age and naturally die. We will be caught up with him. Just as the time, people say, how is this possible? I don't know. When you read in the close of Matthew's gospel, when he came out of the tomb, when he resurrected, read carefully and you'll read that many people came out of the grave at the same time. Now, that was chronicled for a reason, to tell us that the dead in Christ, as Paul says, they will be raised up. And that gives me the glorious hope, as Christ is the first goer and the first pioneer of all this, that I'm going to be following Jesus, and I hope you will too, and that's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.